Sins at Boston Avenue podcast. I am Philip Boone, the director of Mid-High and Confirmation Ministries at Boston Avenue, and my co-host is Caitlin Dryke, the director of communication. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Philip.
Our guest today is Boston Avenue senior pastor, Reverend David Wiggs. David, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Philip. Glad to be back.
Today's topic is a little bit heavy. With the recent events in El Paso and Dayton, we wanted to discuss gun violence and our response as Christians. I think it is important to note as we start this conversation that this is a really tense and polarizing topic right now, that we will try to operate with grace for this whole conversation. That this problem and any solutions to it involve a lot of nuanced approach and understanding, and that the views represented here are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. David, to start off, does church exist in a bubble? Should churches talk about social activities and issues?
I think we do not exist in a bubble, although sometimes churches do function that way and ignore relevant social issues. I've always felt like not only should I have a spiritual life and a relationship with God personally, but if my faith didn't inform my behavior or the way I behaved in civic life or public life, then there was a real disconnect. If you look at the life of Jesus, you can tell that he engaged in issues that were important to people, and he was willing to address issues that were controversial in his day. And some of those were religious, some of those had, moral overtones, some of them had to do with a dominating foreign power that was in his land during his lifetime. So I think the rubber really hits the road with faith is when we can use our faith to help us make decisions and have discussions and navigate difficult issues.
Something I appreciated when I started exploring Methodism was that the Methodist Church specifically has the social principles as part of the Book of Discipline, and that those social principles are a guiding document to understand how Christians within the Methodist Church should engage or understand the world around them. And it's broken up down into different parts, but from everything from the natural world to the social world, to the political world, there's kind of a guide for thinking about your faith and these social issues.
Right. And that's really has a long history in Methodism. Even John Wesley, our founder, before his death, came out against slavery in England and became a part of that political debate that was going on in his country, particularly women in the early 1900s that were Methodist in the United States were part of the temperance movement, which is really the forerunner to our current day Board of Church and Society, and the fact that we have social principles kinds of statements on any number of issues.
And has the Methodist Church, through the Board of Church and Society or another arm, made a statement in regards to the latest shootings? Do you know?
I think some bishops have made statements, I know. I don't know for sure if the General Board of Church and Society made a specific statement. They have done over these last few years as gun violence has escalated in our conversations and in media and across the country. They've done a whole series of studies and statements advocating gun safety in certain positions in terms of peace and justice around gun violence and gun issues in the U.S.
Would you be able to give, for those who don't know, exactly information about who is the Board of Church and Society?
Sure. So the United Methodist Church, being a global denomination, calls that level our general church. And so we have several general boards and agencies that work on everything from higher education to social issues in the cases of the General Board of Church and Society. So they have a board made up of United Methodists from around the world. Their primary calling or directive is to advocate on behalf of the social principles. And then we have a separate set of documents called the Book of Resolutions that every 4 years when the General Conference meets, people offer different resolutions. Some are adopted and some are not. If they are adopted by a majority vote, then it's the job of the General Board of Church and Society to communicate those across the church and to lift those up around certain issues that are being discussed either in government or in cultural conversation.
And those resolutions can be submitted by any lay person of the Methodist Church. It's not, only if you're a delegate or
Correct.
only if you're a
Right.
clergy member. It can be anybody.
Yeah, pastors, lay people, as long as they're a member of United Methodist Church, then they can submit legislation, petitions, resolutions to the General Conference.
I find it interesting because from the UMC website, for what we believe, so the social issues, including gun violence, there's a whole list of beliefs that we have. That there's one that says individual United Methodists who own guns as hunters or collectors to safely and securely store their guns and to teach the importance of practicing gun safety. And that's one thing that's getting lost. And there's a list of them if anybody wants to search for them.
Right.
But one thing that's all it seems that a lot of people really want is just gun safety. Mm-hmm. And it's from both sides is we need to figure out how to have better gun safety, which is what this is kind of hitting at.
Right. And I think a lot of the conversation in our current culture gets polarized so quickly. So if somebody says gun control, everybody assumes they know that they want to take away everybody's guns. Or if somebody else says gun violence, they wanted something else. And I really think it is helpful that the United Methodist Church has focused on gun safety and how do people who own weapons keep them safe. We know they're used for purposes of non-violence in terms of like the recent mass shootings, in terms of hunting or target practice or home safety. And so kind of understanding the nuances of that conversation and not jumping to conclusions, I think is really helpful when those of us as people of faith are grappling with the grief and the mourning and the tragedies that we've been hearing about in the news lately.
It also says that some measures they're advocating at the local and national level for laws that prevent or reduce gun violence, and some measures are universal background checks. All guns are sold through licensed gun retailers. Establishing a minimum age of 21 for a gun purchase or possession.
Right.
So there's a lot of people don't know that this is even here as a part of the United Methodist Church.
Right. There is some background, and there are some statements that can help us reflect. It's not official doctrine of the church, but it is the position as voted on by the most recent General Conference, which happens every 4 years. But I think it's interesting. Nobody argues that you should be able to drive a car without training or without a license. Nobody says that's prohibiting their freedoms in any way. And yet we take a weapon. Cars do kill people. We try to regulate them. We try to license people who are operating them. Really, it seems very similar to me in terms of having firearms, and yet the debate escalates quickly when we begin to talk about any kind of safety measures or regulation around guns. So I feel like there are some pressures within our culture that are more extreme, that kind of escalate the discussion away from a rational or a reasonable way to think about how do we use weapons, how do people keep firearms, what are their purposes, and those kind of things.
One of the things that I've noticed emerge in the last few days, just in conversations that I've seen online or that I've had with friends, is people are operating out of a lot of fear and anxiety, and some of it's not even just, am I safe? I think there's a group of people that have really felt that and felt like, okay, to be safe, now I need to have a gun. And I've seen other folks who are just dealing with this general anxiety around our culture around guns and around mass shootings and around gun violence, who are just feeling kind of hopeless and distressed. So as I think as a faith leader around issues of fear, what can we do when we're feeling fearful, when we're seeing other folks who are feeling fearful? What kind of actions can we take or comfort can we find?
People don't like it when we say we're going to keep people in our thoughts and prayers. And yet prayer for Christians is a really important part of our lives. And our conversation with God and listening to God and receiving comfort and assurance from God, most Christians would say at the core, our safety and assurance really is in God's hands. Not that we don't have decisions to make in our own lives about any number of things which keep us more safe or put us at greater risk. But I think it's not just prayers or thoughts and prayers. I think it's prayers combined with education and learning about the complexities of some of these issues, looking at everything from like what Philip was referring to in terms of legal and illegal sales and what kinds of things are for sale around firearms, as well as other kind of licensing and regulation are all important part of that. So education, advocacy, learning about those issues, participating in the discussion. For some people, I think that would help reduce the anxiety and the fear as they engage with that. For others, it really does escalate it, and they're not in a good place. I mean, I think of people who have been traumatized by a gun incident. And so know a family whose children were at Sandy Hook. So every time there's a mass shooting, it doesn't have to be at a school. It's sort of a re-traumatizing. It's a triggering effect. It brings up that pain and fear again. So people are in a lot of different places. I think the church should be focused on not only the education and all those kind of things we kind of talked about and helping people have rational and reasonable conversations and learn about that, but also we have to be in ministry with people who are in a lot of different places around the fear and the trauma.
I know that I taught for 9 years before coming here, and Caitlin was a teacher as well.
I did.
And whenever I got a new room, the first thing I looked for was the exit to see, are there windows? Is there a good place to hide? Which it's hard, especially in the school setting, because you were taught and you try to tell the students that the school is a safe place. You're safe here. And I was teaching first grade when Sandy Hook happened, and those were first graders. So even though I was so far away, it hit me really hard, and it hit my wife really hard, and because I could imagine that happening there. It's a very difficult conversation. What are the best ways, like if you want to say, because most of the shootings that make the news are school related, what is the best thing for them to do?
How do we minister to
how do
children?
We minister to the children, and how do we help them understand, and what can we do for the children? Because a lot of the children, my first graders, didn't understand why we were doing all of these lockdown drills and all that.
Practice.
So do you have a way or any ideas to minister to them?
I think it's really difficult. You know, in my generation, and I'm older than those of you who are on the other microphones here, but, you know, we were doing kind of like tornado drills and nuclear bomb drills, you know, when we were in school. And you look back at it now, and the answer for a nuclear detonation was get under your desk. Probably not a really key strategy to survive. So I think we've been afraid of different things. I believe people want to keep the children safe. Certainly we've had to look at how we do secure the building once students are in, and how do we deal with who has access during a school day to classrooms and all those kind of things, so that we can try to normalize the environment and keep the environment safe for children. And yet we know some of them have trauma for one reason or another, or something they saw on the news or they've heard their parents talk about, or because of all the drills, they begin to wonder, am I safe here? So I think, you know, really looking at the infrastructure and the structure of how we treat them as they come and go helps normalize that and makes that a safe and hospitable learning environment. But we also have to support teachers and think through the administrative safety kind of procedures as well. I mean, it becomes pretty complex. But I think we, as adults, we should be working on that so that the kids can come and go as safely as possible and focus on learning rather than wondering, do I have to know where the closet is or where the exit is in an emergency if someone starts shooting?
And I think we as adults have largely failed to do anything about this. I'm in kind of a unique situation. I was 9 when the Columbine shootings happened, and it was in my backyard. My school district that I grew up in is the same school district as Columbine. My dad is a high school teacher. He had fellow teachers that he had taught with at previous schools that were at Columbine. So it was very much my community. They evacuated the school to the park that my grandmother walks in every day. And so that has been a pervasive part of my life since I was in third grade. And then my first year of teaching is when Sandy Hook happened. And I got home. My dad, the teacher, called me and said, "What is your plan? What is your plan if it's your classroom?" And he told me what his plan is. And, that's a heavy thing to just put on teachers. And I think that it says that for 20 years, adults have failed to really do anything to secure this. And I think pivoting away from just the gun component around who has guns or who has access to guns or what is regulated or not regulated, I think the church has a position to talk about some of those underlying things, whether it's, I've seen a lot of people posting online that we just don't have enough God in the world. And if we had more God, shootings wouldn't happen. And I don't personally feel like that's it, but I do think that having studied sociology, there is an increasing social disconnect that is undermining our empathy for each other, our ability to support each other. And I think we're seeing a rise in lots of toxic behaviors, including violence, because we don't have the same community connection that maybe we need to head this off. So I don't know if there is space for church as a community to do more, or to just start talking more about it. But that, to me, seems an important element of this dialogue.
Right. And I think churches and people of faith on their own can be more involved in safety and security and protection of children. I think some people are still trying to figure out what to do in a situation where there's that kind of issue presented to them.
We're just coming back from an interruption. The church went into a lockdown, which means that all of us lock our doors, stay behind our doors due to a safety threat. There was somebody in the vicinity with a knife who had already committed some vandalism, and I'm sure that we'll find out more. Now we're all clear, but it's interesting that this happened while we were recording this podcast. I think all of us at the church are grateful that we had a safety plan in place, protocols that we could follow, ways that we could alert each other, to make sure that we're staying safe and that, precautions have been taken. David, we have a safety committee. I don't remember what the official title is, but we have a group of people at the church that particularly look at how we can be safe in the church, right?
That is correct. We have a Safety and Security Council who've done a full inventory of our building. Our building is large and has so many entrance and exits that it's not as simple as, well, everybody just use one door and we'll lock everything else. So with the multiple programs we have with lots of people of all ages in the building every day, we've tried to strike a balance between securing children who are here, which we do very effectively at this point, as well as keeping staff and guests and anybody who might be visiting safe as well, while still maintaining a fairly open building and hopefully warm and a hospitable welcome to any who come to be a part of the ministries here.
Yeah, that's one thing. Whenever I was teaching our classrooms, they told us to lock the doors and just have a door greeter so the doors are always locked. But that's not something you can do in a church because you want to show that you're welcoming to all people. And if people go to your church and it's supposed to be open and the doors aren't open, then what does that say about your church,
right,
as far as being welcoming?
It's interesting. I've talked to people in a whole variety of large churches, our denomination and others, and some have decided the only safe way is to lock down their whole building. Some have armed and uniformed personnel if the door is unlocked as the greeter. We've chosen to go a little different direction than that, try to balance out a little more toward what we think is safe and yet hospitable, and are able to, at this point, been able to balance that.
I know in some of our conversations that we've had on staff about that balance between safety and hospitality. One of the stories that I like to bring up about my past experiences, when I was about to graduate from college and was interviewing for jobs and things like that. I had an interview in Oklahoma City, and at that point I was very not affiliated with a church, was pretty anti-church, but got to Oklahoma City and wanted to change into my suit for an interview. And so we drove up to a church thinking this would be, a great place to come in and change. And the whole church was locked down. And across the street was like a rehab center with bars on their windows, but an open door. And they let me in, and the ladies behind the plexiglass front desk were, wishing me luck and telling me how great I looked and how I was totally going to rock this interview. And so as somebody who wasn't affiliated with a church at that time, it spoke volumes to me about, should I go back to church? Probably not, because the doors aren't open, and I'm going to be welcomed and supported and cared about in community in places that don't look like church. And so I think sometimes our fears and our concerns around our own safety reduce our ability to be in community with other people, and that really hurts the mission of the church.
Right. And, just as we were talking about earlier, the complexities of the whole discussion around guns and safety and violence is more complicated and nuanced than a lot of people seem to suggest that it is. And church life, I would suggest, is the same. There's a great variety of perspectives and stances within Christianity itself, certainly, but even within our denomination as United Methodist, we do not all agree on any number of issues, even though we're all in the same denomination. But we do have to be aware that we are always, no matter what we're choosing, we are making a witness, just like that church did to you that day, of not being hospitable or accepting as you experienced them.
And now that I'm in church community, I realize that, maybe they didn't have the budget to keep their doors open during the day, or maybe those were right. Maybe those were the, not the regular daytime youth stores, or they
at the time.
Right. But at the time it just felt like, oh, this is a church and their doors are closed. Mm-hmm. And so I like that I'm able to now have the perspective of what it might have been like for that church, but also I hope to always carry the perspective of what it's like for somebody who is not of that church.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good.
You were talking about just even in our denomination, such differing views about a whole range of issues. And one thing about this particular issue is that there's very little just talking. There's a lot of yelling,
a lot of online comments.
A lot of online comments, no matter what side of the issue you are on. And my question to you is how to love people with opposing views, but not only that, how to have good dialogue with people that have opposing views. Because I feel like that's something that's missing from a lot of different views about a whole number of issues, is having good dialogue rather than just saying, I'm right, you're wrong.
Right. And I think we have modeled for us, particularly on a lot of communication outlets, thinking specifically of television, where even if the host has a person of a different view on air for an interview, what I find most often is that they try to the host still wants to be correct and right, and so they try to force the person with a different viewpoint into admitting they're wrong or they're stupid.
They invite them wanting to fight,
yes,
more or less.
And I think what the church can do is model honest and genuine and authentic conversation that begins on a basis of we love, or in terms of New Testament, agape love, that we will the good for the other person. We don't wish the other person ill, even if we disagree with them. And so we look for a setting where we can have a conversation that's marked by listening and respect and an effort to really learn and understand where another person's coming from and why, and what we might be able to even find as common ground. And we don't see that modeled very much in our culture anymore. I can't think of any settings where that's their goal, is to actually have that kind of dialogue.
Yeah, I think those kinds of dialogues that allow space for the nuance, because I think every individual has nuance in their perspective, even if they haven't always explored it. I know that I come from a family of gun owners, that my dad is a hunter. We had a rifle by our front door, which in hindsight is a little terrifying that we didn't have that kind of gun safety in our home. But also I think it intimidated a lot of boyfriends. So go dad, I guess. I don't know. But, you know, I come from a family of gun owners. At the same time, we can have conversations around, it's one thing to have a hunting rifle. It's another thing to have something that causes greater destruction. And It's one thing to have a pistol to keep in, you know, in a secure place to keep your family safe. And it's another thing to have 10 pistols. And,
or an assault rifle, or the kind of arms, unfortunately, that the person recently had, where within 30 seconds you can kill multiple people before anyone even knows what's happening. There's we haven't really had time to really even get into the distinctions in terms of what does it mean to have the right to bear arms, and what kind of arms might that mean, and what does it mean if we look at, we did touch on gun sales and legal and illegal gun sales, but in terms of the whole arms trade and who's producing the firearms and who's benefiting from lots of firearms being sold, we haven't really looked at all of that today, and I understand we don't have time to do that, but it does point to the fact that there's a lot of conversation and learning to be had, and I don't see very many settings providing that.
And I think a lot of it has to be just, what do words mean? Because gun control is a big kind of trigger with some people,
right,
about they get upset just hearing that word. Mm-hmm. When gun control has never meant taking away guns, it's basically gun safety. We just want gun safety. And I have a different perspective than Caitlin, because she grew up around guns, and I grew up with my parents never owning a gun. I've never even touched a gun or even come close to shooting a gun. It just does not interest me. So I think it's interesting how, coming from two different perspectives, thoughts about it, because my parents never hunted or any of that stuff. But with gun control, it's not about taking away all of the guns. It's about having gun safety, having, more background check, kind of like what I read earlier, background checks, and getting to a world where where people are treating guns like they should, like being safer with them and more control over them.
Right, and we're thinking about gun violence prevention. That's perhaps a different conversation even than gun control or gun regulation. Is how do we deal with the violence that's being perpetrated in a way that's for the common good?
And I think to the conversation around gun violence versus gun control, there was a really interesting news article written after the California synagogue shooting, where the pastor of the church where the shooter attends was talking about how maybe their church had a greater role in, or should have had a greater role in that person's life in helping them avoid some of the ideas that they were espousing that were so dredged in hate. And so, churches may be taking a greater responsibility in gun violence around how do we talk about concepts like white supremacy and toxic masculinity and such anger and discontent that so many shooters are expressing. And so that's hard, and it's a big lift. But I think that, there are certainly some churches that are looking at maybe we should have a greater role in that.
Right. And, we haven't had a chance to look at the percentages. Mass shootings get a lot of headlines, but we also know we have huge numbers of people using firearms for suicide and homicide that's not in a mass shooting situation. Churches could play a role in having a healthy conversation about that. Mm-hmm. It's, which is separate in a sense than what we're talking about, although it's related. I think just the conversation today kind of motivates me to make sure that here at Boston Avenue, we convene some more of those conversations and provide better opportunities for people to discuss, to learn, to listen, to grieve and mourn when we have mass violence in our culture, and all those kind of things, which we are fortunate haven't touched us personally in a way that we've had a shooting here. But what just happened while we were having the podcast of having someone who's armed on the premises threatening violence certainly ups my awareness of the need for all of us to be engaged and find some clarity about safety and security and helping one another think through these things.
It's important dialogue to continue to have. And with these mass shootings, a lot of times there's a lot of discussion about it for a week or two.
Right.
And then the dialogue slowly goes away. So it's important to always remember so you can help prepare for, in the case an event happens around you, keep you safe.
Right.
Do you have any other things to add, David?
I don't think so. Appreciate you having me today, Philip.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We're at Boston Avenue, located 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa. Check our Facebook page to see what's going on at the church, and we will talk to you later. Bye.